Good evening, I'm Alex Udris, and welcome to Boldmethod Live VFR tonight, where we're talking about possibly our most common set of questions, and that comes in on landings and landing errors. Whether it's through email, phone calls we get, or through input from live, it always seems to be that landings are like our most commonly requested topic. And a lot of us kind of think that landing problems are mostly associated with student pilots or people transitioning to different aircraft types. But really, I can tell you, with over 20 years in the cockpit and thousands of hours flying, I'm constantly working on my landings. They are a skill that fades really fast. And the errors that we're going to talk about today, I think, are the three most common errors we see with students. I also know when I'm flying myself, they're probably the three most common errors that I make. And Colin will definitely attest to that. Colin is producing the show tonight, so he's running both chat and the cameras. If you have any questions as we're going through the show, send them in over chat. Colin will work them into the presentation. We're going to try to keep the flow tonight, starting with a basic understanding of the flare and round out. Then we're going to talk about judging your flare height. We're going to understand the aerodynamics of what's happening in the flare and how you want to time that correctly in terms of height. And then we're going to move on from there into floating, which is, for me, I think one of the most common errors that I typically see. And then from floating, we're going to move on to balloons. I know there are quite a few other things that can go on wrong in a landing, but these things are kind of the three most common problems that we typically see. Tonight, because we're talking about landings and landings errors, we also have a special promotion. Most of you probably know that we have a mastering takeoffs and landings course that you can pick up on our website. We have a link to it down below in the subscription or in the description. And if you purchase that course starting now up through 2 days from now, so midnight Pacific time on Thursday, you'll get a free Boldmethod t-shirt in there as well. I'll talk about that more at the end of the show. So let's start by jumping to the iPad, and we'll kind of go through what we're going to talk about today. So we're going to start by judging flare height. We're going to talk about the aerodynamics of the landing and how to judge flare height. We're going to move from there on to floating. And then finally, we're going to move into ballooning. So let's start with the flare, also known as the round out. And I'm going to play this through. Even though we've got a cirrus shown here, this is true for any type of airplane, especially a tricycle gear airplane, but the general concept is true for tailwheel as well. As you start to descend, we're going to arrest that descent, increasing the angle of attack, generating some lift, and allowing the aircraft to touch down. Okay, so let's walk through this again just a little bit more slowly. Initially, the airplane is descending on its descent path. And you can see at this point here, we're starting to bring the nose up. What we're doing is increasing angle of attack, which is going to increase lift on the aircraft. And the increased lift slows down our descent rate. At the same time, increasing lift increases drag. And by increasing induced drag, we're allowing the aircraft to slow down. And that's bringing us all the way down to basically touchdown or stall speed. So you can see as the aircraft begins to flare up, the nose is starting to move above the horizon. The angle of attack is increasing. Our drag continues to increase. Our descent rate is slowed down because lift is increasing. The airplane will continue to do that until it touches down. And right at this point in time, where it's just basically starting to touch the end of the runway, this is typically where we like to imagine that the airplane is just starting to exceed the critical angle of attack. So right here, or just after here, you'll hear that stall horn chirp, and the airplane sets down. That's the goal. And then from there, we lower the nose gear on. So what this really means is that we have to have a very clear sight picture that we can see out the nose of the airplane, because as you're going through the flare, your eyes are focused outside. You're not really watching airspeed as much in the instruments anymore. You're not watching your heading indicator. If you've got a glass panel, you're not focused on the PFD. As you're moving through the flare, your eyes are focused outside, and you're using that visual sight picture to help you bring the airplane into a landing. So that means that everything needs to be set up correctly as we go into that flare sight picture. You need to be aligned with the runway, on a stabilized descent path, and this is really key, at the right initial approach airspeed. Because if you enter the flare at the wrong speed, if you're too fast, you're going to find that as you increase that angle of attack, you have too much airspeed, you're way below the critical angle of attack, and the airplane doesn't want to stop flying. It just sits there and floats. We'll take a look at that in detail in a second. If you're too slow, as you increase that angle of attack, you'll exceed the angle or the critical angle of attack too early, and the airplane will set down hard or it'll set down early. The floating fast is by far one of the most common problems when we're talking about landing. And when you look in your POH, they typically have a final approach airspeed, so maybe at 50 feet or crossing the threshold, and you need to look at that airspeed and determine what weight that was published for. Many POHs only publish it for maximum gross weight. Others will publish it for max gross and then a lower weight, typically almost a basic empty weight, and it leaves you to interpolate. But if you're flying too fast, if you're really light and you're using an initial approach speed for max gross, excuse me, you'll find that the airplane wants to float. Okay, so let's take that into just judging your flare height. Okay, let's assume that we're set up on speed and we're trying to time our flare. This is possibly one of the most common questions that we get, and that is, how do I know when to flare? And there's a couple different things. One of the things that we tell people is to try to use your peripheral vision to see the height of the buildings, because you want to start your flare at roughly building height. Okay, so maybe a one-story building, and typically that's a T-hangar, or maybe a terminal building if it's not 2 stories. Right as you start to get to the top of the hangars, that's where you want to start your flare. You don't want to look out and look at the buildings. The concept is you're just using that in your peripheral vision. The other concept that you can look at is when the runway starts to zoom. So I'm going to pull that up here first of all. Let's start with the building height, and what you can see right here. This is Steamboat Springs, Colorado, and this video is actually from our Takeoffs and Landings course. These hangars are all about 1 story, a little taller, and as we come in, you'll see the aircraft start to flare right about building height, and you can see it right about there, and you're using your peripheral vision to judge that. And from there, we allow the aircraft to sit down. So we'll watch that one more time. We're using our peripheral vision, and it sets down. The challenging thing here is that depending on the type of airplane that you fly, where your seat is positioned, and how high you are, that will look different to every pilot. So people say, well, how about in my type aircraft, like in a 172? Where do you look? Where should the buildings be on the windshield, or where do you look? And the reality is you can't trust what someone else says, because their seat might be in a different position. They may be a different height. Some people sit very straight in the airplane. Other people tend to slouch forward. Some people have their seat reclined. None of those are wrong. The key is that you want to be in the same position every time, because those little changes can make big differences in how you see things. So one of the things that I tell people is, if you're uncomfortable with that flare height, fly with another pilot or a flight instructor. Just watch that peripheral vision, kind of get an idea of that sight picture as they land, so that you don't have to worry about operating the controls, and develop your own sight picture. Okay, another thing that you can do is you can use kind of the runway width effect. And basically what this says is that as you start to descend, you're going to notice that this runway expands out in the windscreen. Initially, it expands out very, very steadily. And then as you approach the ground, it starts to expand out quickly. It quickly fills the rest of your vision. This can be hard to see on a GoPro camera. And one of the reasons it's so hard when you look at a GoPro, it's got a very, very wide field of view. And our focal view is much more focused. So that width can be hard to judge when you're looking at a GoPro shot. But what we've done is we've actually measured the width and the speed that it's growing. We put that on this little growth rate indicator. And what you'll notice is, as that runway growth rate indicator expands, it means that this runway is zooming out faster in your visual picture. So as you can see, as we come down, the runway is growing fairly steadily in the screen. And now as we get lower and approach flare height, you can see the runway zooms out very quickly. And that's where we start the flare, and the aircraft touches down. So let's watch that again. We'll wind it out. You can see as we come in, watch how the edge of the runway quickly starts to fill the screen. That's the key thing, okay? The runway's more centered, and then all of a sudden it expands to fill the screen. And you can think of that as expanding to fill your peripheral vision. Again, these aren't things that we're focusing on. We're picking up all of this just kind of out of the corner of our eye, out of the side of the windscreen and out of our peripheral vision. You notice the runway starts to fill in quickly into the aircraft's windscreen. You see it expand out in your peripheral vision. So the common errors that we typically see are people flaring high. And you'll see that here. As we come in, the runway's expanding, and it's not expanding very quickly yet. It hasn't filled the peripheral vision. And I start my flare a little bit too early, and I can tell I'm high, so in this case, I'm going to initiate a go-around. And in this case, we're going to start our flare low. You can see that the runway's already expanded to fill our peripheral vision, and we set down a little harder than we want. And that's because as we start the flare, we don't have time to arrest the descent rate fully. If you flare too high, you'll find that as you, in fact, I think we have a slide on this. Nope, we don't on this one. But as you flare too high, you'll find that the aircraft bleeds off speed by generating lift with too much altitude left. And then as it reaches a critical angle of attack, you'll feel it drop onto the runway. And sometimes you feel that kind of sinking sensation. You can usually tell it's happening because the pitch attitude gets abnormally high. Even though you're holding the airplane at landing attitude, you start to feel your butt sink, and you kind of feel like your angle of attack is getting abnormally high. The airplane's starting to sink down. That means your flare was too high. And if it's too low, as you're starting to bring the nose up, the airplane's still descending, it's going to contact the runway. Okay, looks like we have our first question.
Okay, we got a whole bunch of questions in, but this I thought was the most timely to where you are right now. This comes from Chris, and Chris wants to know, he says this: I suppose it depends on the stance of the airplane, but about how far above the runway does this runway expansion start to happen?
That's a really good question, Chris, and I know I say that too much. It's a really good question. It's kind of the running joke now with me. Everything's a great question, but the reality is it's hard to identify because it depends on a couple things. It depends on the width of the runway. Runway width illusions can make this a little bit more difficult. It depends on your airplane and your descent rate, but it's kind of in that 20 to 50, maybe 60-foot range. That's where you're going to start to notice this. And it's right, as I said, kind of in that hangar height range. Both the runway width expansion and the tops of those kind of one-story hangars all occur in roughly the same place. Now keep in mind, you're still typically descending maybe 500 feet a minute, maybe a little less or a little more. It doesn't take long to make that descent from, maybe 60 feet to 40 feet. So it's kind of a general area. And that's one of the reasons why we don't use our altimeter. First of all, it's not sensitive enough, but even if you had a radio altimeter, you don't really use that to time your flare because it's kind of a general area that you're looking for. One of the things, and I just brought up with the runway width zooming, is that on wider runways, that zooming will typically happen at a higher altitude. And narrower runways, that zooming can happen at a lower altitude. And so wider runways tend to make you feel a little bit lower, and you tend to flare a little bit high. Whereas narrow runways, you have to get much closer to them to notice that, and they can make you flare a little bit low. And so that's why we're not just using one thing, the runway width effect, using that, kind of the building height, and your visual sight picture, all those come together to help judge that flare height. Okay, next question.
I forgot to change the invite, so we have a bunch of questions.
You told me we had a lot of questions, but
I'll hop back on here. We do have a lot of questions, but they're going to come up a little bit later here, so we'll let you keep going. We'll get to those in a second.
Take a look at one more thing with that flare height, and I call this the target fixation problem. It's possibly one of my most common issues. This is what I have happen more often than not. And by target fixation, here's what I'm saying. Normally, I tend to aim for the aiming point markers. That's kind of my go-to, partially because if you have a visual approach slope indicator, That's going to guide you in typically to that touchdown zone right here. So sorry, can't call it. I'm making you swap cameras fast. Okay. That's going to guide you into the touchdown zone. So everything's kind of taken you to these aiming point markers. I know some people like to land right on the numbers, but where you're targeting, we tend to look right at that spot. That's how we're judging our glide angle, whether we're high or low. And as we come in, we need to transition our eyes from that point and up to the horizon. That's what you can see happening with this vignette here. The problem is, if you stay focused on this point the entire time, you won't realize that the runway is starting to zoom. You won't see the ground start to rise up in your peripheral vision. You don't really know your pitch attitude because this horizon here is basically, while you can see it, it's not really part of your thinking. It's not in your mind. And so that means that if you stay focused on this point, your flare tends to be very abrupt and oftentimes low. And so if you can think about that, you're sitting there, and it's a habit that I get into, especially when I'm trying to do point landings, when we're trying to film like spot landings, or I'm trying to hit a specific point. I can get over fixated on that point, and I'm sitting there, I'm staring at it, and then all of a sudden I look up, and it's this kind of really abrupt flare, which tends to lead to either ballooning or bouncing. It just isn't very smooth, and oftentimes it's a little bit too low. So one of the things that I always tell people is, and I tell myself, when I start to realize that I'm doing this, is as I get across that runway threshold, okay? As I start to cross the concrete, so I maybe, 1,000 feet from my touchdown point, my eyes come up to the horizon. And I focus on the end of the runway and the horizon, and I keep my eyes there and allow my peripheral vision to do the work as I start to judge the aircraft coming into the flare. And that's, I found, a thing for me. That target fixation is possibly my most common flare error, and I have to tell myself, get my eyes up, look down the runway, look out at the horizon, and start to feel that flare, and immediately my landings get smoother. Okay, next question.
Okay, next question is this. Is there a specific angle or pitch attitude you should be at for the flare?
Yes, there is, but it depends on each airplane and essentially what you're going to see. And when I say this, the angle of attack won't change. Okay, so essentially in a flare, you're basically holding the aircraft right below the critical angle of attack. And in fact, I'll go back to that slide here as we start to touch down. Okay, so you can see as the aircraft comes through, watch this. What we're trying to do is get the aircraft right to the point where it's coming right up to the critical angle of attack. That angle of attack maybe is right here, so that as the airplane touches down, it's just exceeded it. Okay, so if the aircraft was to have an angle of attack indicator, you'll find that that landing angle of attack is the exact same angle of attack on the angle of attack indicator every single time. If you get into a Navy aircraft like a F-18 or a Navy fighter aircraft, angle of attack is how they land all of the time. It is perfectly accurate. Many GA aircraft aren't equipped with angle of attack indicators. They're starting to show up more and more. You see them in some of the newer Garmin equipment. There's add-ons. People are installing them in airplanes. And the airplane essentially should touch down at the same angle of attack every time. That's a really reliable indicator. Here's the problem. It's typically not in our field of view while we're landing as a pilot. My angle of attack indicator is on my primary flight display in the bottom left corner. That's not where my eyes are looking as I'm bringing the aircraft into a flare. So for me, as I'm landing, that angle of attack indicator is outside of my scan pattern. And the reality is I just need to use that visual sight picture to fly it in from there. And when you think about a military aircraft, those are typically up on the HUD, so they're right in the sight picture. Okay, so if you don't have an angle of attack pattern that you can work, or angle of attack indicator that you can work into your scan pattern, the visual picture that you get for that landing attitude will change. Okay, it should always be the same for you at a certain weight and a certain aircraft configuration. But, you, another pilot, between Colin and I, we're different heights, we're going to have slightly different visual pictures. So what I'm getting at is this. It's very important as you're learning to land any type of airplane, to keep your seat in the same position, find a position that's comfortable, and keep it there. Sit in the same position. If you normally sit back, make sure that on final, your seat's back, you're sitting back every time. Don't start hunching forward. You'll notice that your sight picture changes. And then develop that visual picture where that nose should be on the horizon or in relation to the horizon for each touchdown. And try to keep the aircraft's weight relatively similar. Don't go out and fly one landing at maximum gross and then another one with min fuel and you flying out solo, because those sight pictures will start to change. But for a given aircraft load, your seat in the same position, you sitting up the same way, you'll find that that sight picture for your aircraft really shouldn't change for you. And so what you want to do is just develop that, learn to see what that looks like, and then you could start to change things up. As you're lighter, you notice the aircraft pitch attitude is going to change. As you're heavier, it might change a little bit, but it doesn't typically change a lot. By the way, this is one of the reasons why when people go out and practice solo flights, they notice their landings are a little bit tougher. They feel like the airplane wants to float. Their flares are a little bit off. It's because you don't have that extra load of your CFI in the airplane. But again, developing that sight picture is absolutely essential. Sometimes it's just very helpful to have someone else fly the landing and you sit out there and watch from the left seat and just kind of absorb what it looks like. And then other times, after you get used to that, you want to keep doing it yourself and just thinking about, okay, where's the nose? Let me hold it there, keep it there, see how things react. Okay, from Flair, we're going to bring this into floating. And floating complicates the Flair because A, it prolongs it unnaturally, and it tends to lead to a whole bunch of other errors, like ballooning and sometimes bouncing. But floating always stems from an airspeed issue. The problem is, remember when we talk about the aircraft flaring and landing, what we're trying to do is use drag and lift to slow the airplane down and to slow down its descent so that it touches down right as it exceeds the critical angle of attack and basically with almost no descent rate. If you fly final approach fast, you're going to find that you have to bleed off a lot more airspeed, and that completely changes your flare. So airspeed is absolutely critical. And what we typically find is that people like to fly final approach way too fast. Either ATC's asked you to speed up. More commonly, people just aren't familiar with the appropriate final approach speed for the airplane, or they look at that number in the POH and they say, okay, that's way too slow. And so they fly the aircraft 5, sometimes even 10 knots faster. And then they have a hard time landing it, or the airplane consistently lands flat with too much speed. And so when we talk about floating, it is always an airspeed issue. So here's a good example of us floating in Steamboat. Our normal final approach speed should be about 79. And you can see we're about 5 knots fast, 84 here. And as we go into the flare, drag is slowing down my airspeed. But you can see we wanted a touchdown on the aiming point markers, and we continue well past them down the runway. We'll watch that one more time. So I'm about 5 knots fast. I want a touchdown here. Drag's pulling my speed down. But it takes a good several stripes before I've got the aircraft even close to my critical angle of attack or stalling speed. And so the airplane's moved about 3 or 4 stripes here, so maybe 600 feet, well outside of the point where I wanted to touch down. So when we talk about ground effect, it's something we talk about with soft field landings, but it is also the reason you float. So ground effect is primarily caused by a reduction in drag due to your wingtip vortices. So right here you can see we've got wingtip vortices spiraling off the back of the wing. And that's because you have high pressure air right here below the wing pushing up against the low pressure air on top of the wing. Some of that air slips around the wingtip. that causes a wingtip vortice. And you'll notice that it's bending the airflow down. Call this downwash, okay? This downwash changes the angle of the relative wind. So instead of having lift pointing straight up, what actually happens is that downwash starts to bend the lift back a little bit. So when the wind bends back, you end up with this little component of rearward lift, and that is essentially your induced drag. Okay, so as the aircraft starts to fly closer to the ground interferes with those wingtip vortices. It shrinks them. And that causes that, as you can see, watch this downwash, and you'll notice it starts to decrease. So as the relative wind straightens up, you lose that rearward lift. It starts pointing more vertically. And so essentially what's happening is you're reducing the aircraft's drag. Normally, that sounds like a good idea. You know, ground effect's fantastic in the fact that it reduces drag, so it should make the airplane more efficient. But when you're landing, you actually would like the airplane to be less efficient because you're trying to increase the angle of attack to not only increase lift, slowing your descent rate, but you're also trying to increase drag to bleed off your airspeed so that you touch down right at touchdown speed. And as you get closer and closer to the ground, induced drag's decreasing, and so that reduces your ability to slow the airplane down. Essentially, you're getting rid of your drag parachute at the back of the airplane. It becomes harder and harder to slow the plane down. And if you're flying fast, it can become very difficult. It takes up a lot of runway before you can get that airplane slowed down to your normal touchdown speed. Okay, looks like we got a question.
Okay, Chris wants to know this. He says, I'm recently having to switch to a low wing from a high wing aircraft. Are there any major landing characteristics I need to know about when I'm transitioning from my high wing to the low wing?
Good question. And actually, we got a slide that covers this. So first of all...
Good timing.
Always great timing. First of all, every airplane's a little bit different, okay? Whether it's a SR-20, 22, Mooney, Warrior, 172, 182, they all land a little bit differently. And when we talk about the differences between a high wing and a low wing, they're kind of general, theoretical, I would say, because you'll find that some high wings really want to float and some low wings don't. Our Cirrus, the Turbo Cirrus, does not want to float. It's heavy. It has a fairly low camber wing. When you bring that throttle to idle, the engine basically acts as a brake and the airplane just stops right on a dime. So that even though it's a low wing, that really doesn't want to float at all. And I know high wings, 152s, 172s, to me seem to float much more. But there is kind of a conceptual difference between a high wing and a low wing, and we'll go through that here. And basically, if you think about it, on a high wing airplane, the wing is located probably 4 to 5 feet higher than it is in a low wing airplane. And what that means is, theoretically, in a low wing aircraft, the ground is going to have more of an effect on the wingtip vortices because they're closer to the ground. And so on a low wing aircraft, you may find that the aircraft wants to float a little bit more. But there are so many factors that go into the way an airplane feels. Its weight, the design of the wing, the engine, and how much essentially energy an idle engine absorbs from the air. Because think about it, if you're not using fuel to spin the propeller, if you've got that engine all the way at idle and you're using wind to spin the propeller, you're taking energy out of the wind, which is creating drag. That windmilling engine is essentially slowing you down. Small engines tend to slow you down a lot less than high performance engines, especially like a big turbocharged engine. They really act as a brake. But theoretically, and kind of in general, low wing airplanes are, the wings are closer to the ground, and so you have more of a ground effect as the aircraft enters the flare. Okay, next question.
Okay, Steve has a question that's right along this floating issue, and he says this: my IFR approach speed is faster than the recommended POH final approach speed. How should I handle that on an approach?
Great question. You know, when you really think about an instrument approach, and especially let's take an ILS, because this is one of my favorite examples. We typically fly the ILS with partial flaps in any airplane. Very few aircraft would fly them. Light general aviation aircraft will fly them with full flaps. And so, you know, in the SR-20 and the 22, we fly them with 50% flaps. I know a lot of 172s tend to fly them maybe 20 degrees. It's partial flaps, and you're typically much faster. So for us, our final approach speed is 100 knots. I know that is typical for for quite a few single-engine general aviation aircraft. People like to fly that ILS at about 100 knots indicated airspeed. And then we need to slow down to a touchdown speed with partial flaps in our airplane of about 85 knots. So we have to lose 15 knots between the point where we go visual and where we touch down. And I know in a lot of lighter aircraft like 172s, 150s, 52s, you have to lose even more speed. So there's a couple things that factor in here. Number one, make sure you're using the final approach speed for your flap setting that you fly the approach at. So for us, we fly the approach at 50% flaps. I'm going to use the 50% flaps final approach speed. In the excuse me, in the SR-22T, the G6 and G5, that's about 85 knots. And number two, I need to get the airplane slowed down to that while maintaining my glide slope. And so typically what that means for me is I'm going to break out once I go visual and I say, okay, yep, I got the runway environment sight, visibility is met, normal position, I'm continuing the procedure. At that point in time, I'm going to start a fairly quick throttle reduction to help slow the airplane down. I'm not going to increase flaps. A lot of people say, well, I'll add that last notch of flaps to help slow me down. Well, first of all, that just gets you a slower landing speed. So you have to slow down even more. And as you increase flaps, you're typically going to increase lift significantly. And that tends to destabilize the approach, which is the last thing you want to do in inclement weather, especially if it's windy, there's low clouds, low visibility. You want to try to keep that approach stable. So what I'm going to do is bring that throttle to idle fairly smoothly and fairly, you know, again, it depends on your airplane, but I'm going to start that reduction fairly soon as I go visual, usually right as I'm coming through maybe 150, 100 feet. And I'm going to start trimming back on the trim wheel because the airplane's trimmed for typically a much faster airspeed on final. So I'm going to bring the trim back to help me go through that flare. And basically, I'm just doing a coordinated power reduction and then back pressure trim event so that the airplane gets to that essentially maybe about 1,000 feet in front of my touchdown, right at my touchdown speed. That takes a lot of practice and finesse because it is a fairly abrupt power change. And that's actually one of the issues in single engine airplanes. When we fly fast final approaches, the slowdown to landing can be very difficult. So that's something I always tell people you should practice. A lot of times when we're in instrument training or when we're doing our proficiency work, once we've got our instrument rating, everything goes to a missed approach. And it's great to practice a missed approach. But practicing that transition from approach speed to touchdown speed takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of finesse. My best suggestion, again, know exactly what speed you're aiming for and where that should happen on the runway, and then just get used to a fairly, when I say abrupt, I don't mean sudden, but I mean, you know, faster than you would on a visual approach, bringing that power back to start the airplane decelerating and then pitching up and retrimming so that the aircraft maintains its glide slope, but you start bleeding off airspeed. So, you know, right as you come across the threshold, usually you're right back at your appropriate final approach speed. And again, normally that's your final approach speed that you would use with partial flaps. Okay, let's take a look. Let's take that though into floating because again, on an instrument approach, everybody tends to arrive at the threshold just a little bit fast and floating becomes an issue. So what happens when the aircraft floats? We saw that, you know, we have reduced drag. How do we fix that? So I'm gonna pull that up. The key is that we want to hold our landing pitch attitude. Essentially, as we come in here, we're a little fast. We're going to hold this pitch attitude right here. You can see how my pitch really isn't changing until the aircraft sets down. We'll watch that again. So right here, I'm just bleeding off speed while holding the pitch attitude steady. And I allow the aircraft to basically slow down and touch down. So this takes, a really good understanding of what my visual reference is for landing, where should the nose be in relation to the horizon, and then as the aircraft's slowing down, you're going to continue to add a little back pressure because your elevator is becoming less and less effective. So you're adding back pressure, and you might need to increase, if you have a crosswind, you're increasing your crosswind deflection as the aircraft slows down, but you're holding that landing pitch attitude, just keeping the nose there. That is increasing the aircraft's angle of attack, but you're keeping that nose right at that pitch attitude on the horizon until the aircraft starts to touch down. The other thing that you need to identify is a point at which you need to execute a go-around or a missed approach. There's some concerns on the instrument side that we won't get into, and that is you really don't want to execute a missed approach back into IMC past the missed approach point because obstacle protection isn't guaranteed, so you really want to try to make that landing work, which means you need to be on speed. But in a visual, like a visual circuit around the pattern, you should always have this point, okay, where if I float farther than this, I'm going to take the aircraft around. Okay, so that point, initially, on long runways, if you have 9,000 feet or 7,000 feet and you only need a couple thousand, you could stand afloat for maybe 1,000 feet or more and still land the airplane. But it really doesn't teach good pilot technique. So for me, I start typically, if runway length is an issue, by saying, okay, I'm not going to float more than 5 stripes. And then we start to bring that back, and then maybe 4 stripes, 3 stripes. So for me, it's typically I won't allow the aircraft to float more than 2 stripes. And that starts to build your landing proficiency. As you start to work in short fields, now you need to kind of identify a point where, hey, if I haven't touched down by here, I don't have enough distance to safely bring the aircraft to the stop. I know my ground roll is maybe 1,500 feet, and I'm going to add a significant margin. I kind of like to double that. So I want at least 2,500 feet of runway in front of me. So I'm adding a little less than that to get the airplane stopped. And I'll look at the airport diagram and figure out where that is and maybe pick like a taxiway or a turnoff and say, okay, if the aircraft hasn't touched down by this point, I'm going to take the aircraft around. Okay, on the IFR side, as I said, you never want to force a bad landing, but the concern is if you execute a missed approach after you've left your decision altitude or descended below your minimum descent altitude, you're no longer guaranteed obstacle protection until you've climbed yourself back above the point where you're kind of above that obstacle clearance slope. And there's no real good way to identify where that is. So in our next video, we're going to talk about criteria to descend below DA, MDA, and one of the things we talk about is a normal position to land. You need to be in a normal position to land. You really do want to make sure as you're leaving DA or MDA and continuing the descent down to the runway, that the aircraft is in a position where you really don't need to make a go-around. Your speeds are stabilized, or you know that you can get them down to your final approach touchdown speed. You're at the speed you should be at, and you know how to slow the airplane down to land, and you want to make sure that you're proficient enough to get the airplane slowed down and safely touch down. And if you do have to execute a go-around, if the landing isn't stabilized, if something runs onto the runway or someone taxis onto the runway and you have to execute a go-around, you need to decide fairly quickly whether you can safely complete a circuit in the pattern. The ceilings are above like 1,000 feet, and you could safely take the airplane around the pattern. That might be the safest decision. Or whether you're going to execute a missed approach and you need to quickly get the aircraft climbing so that you can get back above the obstacle clearance slope. Okay, looks like we got another question.
Okay, Jeff wants to know, how much of a role does temperature play in floating?
So when we talk about temperature and floating, there's a couple things. Number one, the density altitude will increase as temperature starts to increase, and that increases your final approach ground speed, but it shouldn't basically factor into your final approach indicated airspeed. The beauty about our airspeed indicators is that they are also subject to the changes of temperature. They feel less pressure the warmer the temperature gets. So as long as you're using the appropriate final approach airspeed published in your POH, that's independent of density altitude or pressure altitude. However, you'll find that on high DA days, hot days, or hot and high days, you have a much higher ground speed. And so what that means is a little bit of float will carry you a much farther distance. And one of the things that we notice, flying in steamboat on a hot summer day, a little bit of float, an extra 5 knots of airspeed in steamboat carries us a lot farther because we're going about 20 knots faster than it would if we were landing on the coast of California, where our ground speed is much slower. However, there's another part of temperature that can start to play a little bit of an effect. And one of that is as you start to flare over an asphalt runway, a dark runway. Those are dark bodies. They absorb a lot of heat on a hot summer day, and they radiate that heat back up in the form of thermals. And those thermals can also cause the aircraft to float. So if you ever feel like, you got this really stabilized descent rate, and as soon as you come over the runway, especially on a summer day, but it can happen in the winter as well, on a dark asphalt runway, you can just feel that lift. The descent goes completely away. That's air rising off the warm runway. And that also can cause a little bit of float because you have a little bit of lift. So the key thing with float, when you have float, is to reduce your airspeed just a little bit. If you're floating significantly on your final approach, go around, fly the same approach again with a slightly slower final approach speed. So as you cross that threshold, a couple knots slower. That should help fix the float. One of the advantages is when you have a headwind, you're not going to notice it as much, because headwind's already slowing down your ground speed. But one of the most difficult landings to really nail on a point is a hot summer landing on an asphalt runway with a light airplane in the middle of the dead calm summer, because the thermals coming off the runway will basically add a lot of lifting action to the airplane as it starts to fly down the runway. But again, the key thing, especially if you're on a check ride, and you're going, okay, this isn't right. I know I'm going to float. Take the airplane back around the pattern. The examiner needs to see you make it go around anyway. And then reduce that final approach airspeed by a knot or two and try it again. Again, the key thing here is you've got to be able to control your final approach airspeed. If you're struggling to hit your final approach airspeed, that's probably why you're floating, and it makes it really difficult to fix floating. Okay, so what happens if a float it results in an abrupt pitchback? You end up with a balloon. And a lot of times when we talk about controlling the airplane in float, especially with newer pilots or pilots who are very tense, the float immediately turns into a balloon. And it's because we're abrupt on the controls, we start pulling back too aggressively, and the airplane starts to climb back out. So let's take a look at that. So you can see here, right there, the aircraft started a balloon. We'll watch it again. I'm a little bit fast, not a lot, but just a little bit fast in my final approach speed here. And right there, I pitch up too aggressively, and you can see the aircraft starts to balloon and then settles back down. We'll watch that one more time. So right there, you can see the aircraft lift up and then start to settle back down. So here's what's happening. Is the aircraft is descending, we pitch up abruptly, causing the angle of attack to increase. And then that creates additional drag, which slows down our indicated airspeed. So that brief increase in lift starts to die off, and the airplane starts to sink back down. And to prevent the descent rate from continuing to increase, we have to keep increasing the aircraft's angle of attack, and balloons oftentimes lead to a hard landing. If it's a very small balloon, you can typically stabilize the angle of attack and resume the flare. But if the aircraft balloons significantly, what's happening is you're stuck with a fairly high angle of attack. That's what caused the balloon. And then to arrest the descent rate, you have to keep increasing that angle of attack, and the aircraft oftentimes stalls out high and lands hard. And so, you go back to this, people say, well, okay, should I, as the aircraft starts to go up, should I pitch the aircraft down? That's one of the most common questions we get. If the aircraft starts to balloon, is it appropriate for me to push forward on the yoke or pitch the airplane down? The problem is you do that, you're not very high above the ground, and that change has a huge effect on your angle of attack. it typically causes you to fly back in and strike on your nose gear or to land very flat, which can quickly turn into a porpoise or a bounce. So if you start to balloon, pushing forward on the yoke is never a solution, okay? What we want to do is if we catch the balloon early, is if you see the ground start to pull away out of your peripheral vision, stop increasing the angle of attack. Just hold the pitch constant, okay? And then as the aircraft starts to settle down, if that balloon happened, it was very mild and very late in the flare, just start increasing the back pressure again to hold that landing pitch attitude. If the balloon is small, if you catch it early, and you haven't gained significant altitude or increased angle of attack much, you can oftentimes solve it by just pausing on the angle of attack, pausing on your pitch increase, and then slowly resuming that pitch increase. Sometimes you might need to add just a little bit of power to try to cushion out that descent rate. But if you catch it early, just pausing the angle of attack and then bringing the pitch attitude back should be enough. However, if you really start to see the aircraft climb, the problem is there's really nothing that you can do with angle of attack at that point in time, because no matter what, you're going to run out of it before the aircraft reaches the ground. You're going to exceed that critical angle of attack before the aircraft's got itself back down to a low altitude and is ready to touch down. And so in that scenario, I always tell people, take the airplane around. Even highly experienced pilots who hear horror stories of balloons that they try to save that turn into bounce landings and runway excursions. And, you know, in any of those, like, man, I really could tell it just started a balloon. If you really feel it, if it's that big and it surprises you, take the airplane around and fly another approach. Again, typically when you see a balloon, it's caused by an abrupt increase in angle of attack that you do, and that happens for a couple of reasons. Number one, target fixation. You're looking at that touchdown point and you abruptly look up at the horizon and you go, okay, and you make a fast flare. Another one is pilots tend to get, especially in training, very tense during the landing, and so you're really tensed up and gripping the controls. If you've got kind of that steel grip on the yoke, a couple of things you can do is you can loosen up, hold only with 1 or 2 fingers, or use a pencil in between your fingers so that you can't really press down hard. You'll start to feel the pressure on your fingers. Another thing that I notice when pilots are very tense, they tend to lean forward. So as opposed to sitting back and flying naturally with our back against the back of the seat, we start to hunch forward and kind of really crowd up on that instrument panel. And you know, that right there will lead to an abrupt back pressure. And so one of the things I know when I'm doing a biennial flight review, or when I was getting checked out in the SR-20 and the SR-22 at times, my instructor, Ken, would look at me and go, hey man, you're really sitting forward. And that's all he has to do is say that. And it's like, yeah, I got to lean back and sit back in my airplane. That makes me relax right there. And if you find that you're hunching forward a lot and super stressed, one of the things you can do is put a tennis ball behind your back, in between your back and the seat, right about your shoulder height, and try to hold it there. If you start to lean forward, that tennis ball will fall, and the aircraft, that just shows that you're very abrupt. And you can see here, this is a good example of a landing that had a big balloon. You see the aircraft comes up. Oh, sorry, let me do that again. That was a small balloon. We'll look at that one more time. Okay, so we have a small balloon. The aircraft climbs a little bit. I hold pitch attitude. And we still make it down right about our touchdown point. A little bit harder than I normally would have wanted, but still right about our touchdown point. So an abrupt pitch up causes a slight balloon. We hold the pitch attitude, and then it comes back down. This one here, you can see we start the back pressure a little too high and a little too abrupt. We get significant climb. Right there, I can tell, you know, right at this point, you can tell that the aircraft has significantly ballooned. And now we're going to increase power and take the airplane back around. Okay, looks like that's all the time that we've got for tonight. We've got IFR, descent below DA, and MDA coming up in 10 minutes after this. We're going to talk about how to get the aircraft, what the criteria are to get the aircraft below decision altitude, minimum descent altitude, what you're looking for, how to judge flight visibility. We'll talk a little bit about visual descent points. So if you're an instrument-rated pilot or in instrument training, check that out. There's a link in the description. As I said, a lot of these videos came from our Mastering Takeoffs and Landings course, and we've got a special going on with that course now through midnight Thursday. If you pick up the course, we'll also send you a free t-shirt, and there's a link to purchase the course down in the description. It's our most popular course, and like everything, comes with a 30-day money-back guarantee, so there's really no risk to try it. And we hope to see you in 2 more weeks for Bold Method VFR Live. Thanks for joining in. Have a great night.